Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. We're so glad that you're joining us. A lot to get to with the Flint water crisis and education in Michigan, but the debate that has grabbed the nation is over gun control. Politics, policy, and procedure collided this week with an all-nighter in Congress. Both parties angry over blocked bills on gun control legislation. A bipartisan group came forward in the Senate to propose denying gun sales to people on the no-fly list and people who have mandated extra security checks before they fly. Is this yet another case of making noise and no action? Is there really such a thing as bipartisan gun control legislation? And could this finally be some kind of tipping point? There is a lot to tackle here, including how the conversation about guns plays into the presidential race. Let's bring in our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. It's good to see you guys. How are you?
Good to see you.
All right, so I'm going to ask you, Nolan, first. What went through your mind this week as we saw everything percolating in Washington, especially what happened on the floor of the House on Wednesday with the Democrats?
Well, it's more political grandstanding and opportunism in the face of crisis at a time when we should be coming together and addressing real issues. You know, everybody's sort of grabbing up their little piece of where they think they can exploit this tragedy and shaking it in the other side's face. In the case of this bill, I mean, it should take us back that you have both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump backing this measure. This, you know, this is not about gun control. This is, or the Second Amendment. I mean, this is about the Fifth and Sixth Amendment and stripping people of their constitutional rights based on a highly questionable list. That no-fly list is 1.5 million names on it. There are names of largely Muslim Americans, but there are names of people, of babies on that, of people who have made phone calls to somebody who made a phone call, have no idea why they're on the list, don't know they're on the list, have no due process rights to get off the list. This is a mess. You don't want to base legislation on these lists.
So the bipartisan bill is saying, though, that there would be a process to get off that list.
Yeah. Well, then you do that. You have the due process before you start denying people their rights. You shouldn't show up at a gun store or at an airport or at your bank and find out you've lost your rights, and then your due process starts to get your rights back. That's not how the Constitution works.
You look at some of the polls, though, Stephen, and you have people, 80% of the American public say, you know what, we're fine with this. We're fine with denying the ability for people who are on this no-fly list to the ability to buy guns, and if they then get cleared, then they can have them.
Well, I mean, it comes down to what you think is tolerable, right? Is the worst thing that could happen that somebody is denied the right to buy a gun, or is the worst thing that could happen that somebody who's not supposed to have a gun gets one and does something terrible with it? And I think the American public is pretty clear about that. Every other right in the Constitution is handled in a way that prevents, that weighs the one set of liberties against another. The liberty to not be shot in a nightclub, the liberty to not walk down the street and think somebody's going to shoot across the street at you. We don't talk enough about those liberties, and no one's saying that legal gun owners should lose their rights. They shouldn't. But if that happens in the course of trying to prevent these mass shootings, which are not legal and not covered by the Constitution, that's one thing. Now, I agree about the fly list. I mean, it's a mess. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on there, and I think you have to fix that before you start enforcing the no gun buy on it. But we always retreat to this position where gun advocates end up saying, well, you can't do this because it won't work. What we need to talk about is, let's fix the fly list, and then let's make sure that nobody on it is getting a gun.
But let me ask you this, though. But is this the issue when we're talking about gun control legislation? Is this what we should be concentrating on in terms of a no-fly list? Should we be concentrating on an assault weapon ban? Should we be concentrating on more funding going to medical research into why some of these mass shootings are happening?
What we should be looking at in this case is why. I mean, you want to talk about the no-fly list and the terror watch list. This guy wasn't on either one of them. This Omar Mateen wasn't on either one of them. Had 3 contacts, including the day he bought the guns. You had a gun owner reporting him, and that information.
And I think that's what's disappointing, because people talk about, if you see something, say something. Right. And this gun shop owner saw something and said something, and they never visited him.
So instead of sitting all over Congress on an issue these folks know is going nowhere and know is problematic from a constitutional point of view, they should be examining again why our intelligence service isn't working. If you've got I'm telling you, if you've got 1.5 million people on a no-fly list and 57,000 people on the terror list and 57,000 on the no-fly list, you've got bigger problems in this country than gun measures. I mean, they need to cull that down to the true threats and then start dealing with them. And then I think you can have bipartisan agreement. But I mean, going back to the poll and the trading liberties, we know that once you start trading liberties for security, it never ends. One deprivation leads to another. You've got a right-wing group out there saying, yeah, nobody on the terror watch list should be allowed to go to a mosque or congregate with other Muslims. It's a slippery slope, and it always is.
We've always been able and had to figure out ways to balance certain sets of liberties against others. I mean, this idea that we don't do that with every other amendment is just patently false. It's just not the way it works.
We don't deny due process in any
We don't,
other
but no
amendment.
one's arguing to deny due process.
Basing this on the terror watch list would
But
do
what
that,
we're saying
Steve.
is fix the list. Fix the list.
That's
install a due process.
not in that legislation.
In the Senate bill, there is. It would fix the due process.
What it would do is
concerns.
provide a waiting list where you can go and finally get your rights back.
Look,
but you should not be on a list without being notified.
This
and
is the way
without
the Constitution works. There is no right in the Constitution that is absolute. It can be abridged for any number of reasons. They get abridged all the time. Even Justice Scalia, in a really important speech that he used to give, would talk about that there's nothing sacrosanct in the Constitution about individual rights. They are all subject to government regulation, especially when it comes to public safety.
And I think it's interesting. Go ahead, finish your
The only
point.
amendment that we don't have a rational conversation about where that abridgment should exist and should not is with the Second Amendment.
Which is subject to a stack of regulations that.
Like
And,
what?
okay, well, hang on one second, Noah, and something I want to throw into this conversation. It was a quote that jumped out at me that Lindsey Graham said. And he said, to my friends at the NRA, I understand your concern about denying somebody the right to buy a gun, but every right, whether speech or buying a weapon, has boundaries on it. Do you
Of course,
agree with
and there are
that?
boundaries on buying a gun.
I can
there
buy
are
an
a stack.
AR-15 in 15 minutes around the corner from here. So what are the limits on
You
gun
can,
ownership?
if you can clear the FBI list, Steve. And and again, we're hung up then on cosmetic weaponry.
No,
instead
I'm
of-
saying it's
you
too
can't
easy for
buy
anyone to go buy a gun.
You can't buy an automatic weapon.
Sure, I can.
You
Around
cannot.
why not?
Because it's illegal.
I can buy a semi-automatic weapon,
Which is
And
a
what's
lot
the
different,
difference?
about 1,000 rounds a
Right.
minute.
Enough to kill 49 people
1,000
overnight in a nightclub, right?
rounds
Let
over
me-
the course
let me
of
ask-
5
let me-
hours. I've got a dozen guns in my closet that will do that.
Let me ask you this, Nolan. As a gun owner, and as
safe.
someone who's a responsible gun owner, let me ask you this: why does someone need an AR-15?
It's not about need. I mean, why do you need a lot of things you have in life? An AR-15 is no different in its lethality, its killing power, probably less so than the deer rifles I have in my gun safe.
So ultimately, what we're talking about here is what is the cost of the liberty that gun owners want to exercise, right? And that's something that we balance all the time. Is the cost of their liberty the chaos that the rest of us have to live with in a nightclub in Florida, on a street in East Detroit? You know, you've got a little girl walking around who'll be crippled for the rest of her life because she was shot just a few months ago here. At some point, we should talk about. I don't want to take your guns. If you want to have.
If you don't, Steve, then you're not going to solve the problem.
So, but this idea that any restriction will infringe your rights and not take them away from criminals is absurd.
There are a lot of restrictions, Steve, and what we're talking. My point here is we gravitate to the feel-good solutions. We had
I'm not
an
talking
assault
about
weapon-
feel-good
We had
solutions.
an assault weapons
Yeah.
ban in this country,
And that's not what I'm talking about.
And death by the mass shootings didn't decrease. And since that ban's lifted, we've had a 36% decrease in
I'm not talking about
shootings
assault
by
weapons
rifle.
bans. What I'm talking
What are you
about
talking
is
about then?
addressing the nexus between legal gun sales and illegal possession. That's what goes on. None of these guns.
I don't think anybody would
hold on.
oppose that, Steve.
But none of these guns get stolen from manufacturers. They get sold, they get distributed to gun shops and other places, and they get sold, and then they end up in illegal hands. And there is no constitutional right for that to happen. There's no
I agree
constitutional protection for
wholeheartedly
that.
with that,
And we
Steve.
ought to be able to.
So where
I
is the
agree
solution then?
wholeheartedly with that.
I think.
But that's not what's on the table.
Hang on, where's the solution?
Why shouldn't guns be heavily registered? Why shouldn't gun owners have to get a license like they do in other civilized countries in order to have the gun and to use it? I mean, the idea of putting more onus on legal gun owners to make sure that their guns do not fall into the hands of criminals is perfectly reasonable and not an abridgment
Why
of their
wouldn't
rights.
gun owners want that, Nolan?
Well, I think most gun owners do, and I think most gun owners are responsible and do try to keep their guns out of hands.
So then how do we have so many weapons in illegal hands?
But in this case, again, we're changing the subject. In this case, he bought his guns legally.
Yes.
He was a guy who should have been under the FBI watch and wasn't, and he cleared the registry.
But I don't think we need to.
These were not illegal
I don't
guns.
think
No,
that we
they
can
weren't.
have. Hang on, we can have the gun debate and just look back at the most recent mass shooting
look
and
at
say,
everything that
well,
goes
in this
on.
situation, this wouldn't have happened.
Well,
or
look
this
at the
wouldn't
last
happen.
5 then, and find one in which in which a gun law that's on the table would have stopped them.
My question is, are we wasting time in Congress right now fighting over the no-fly list when we should be talking about gun show loopholes,
we
when
ought
we
to be
should be
talking
talking
about-
about
we ought to be talking
different
about
things?
possession.
What
What
I'm
we should
saying-
be talking about is how we address domestic terrorism and how do we keep our young men, our young citizens from being radicalized, even self-radicalized by the ISIS.
that is
organization.
part of it.
That
Yes,
was
that
the
is part of
motivator
it.
here. That's the issue here.
It's far
And it's a
more-
lot easier
it's
to
far more
talk about gun control
radicalization of-
and everything else than it is to hold this administration accountable for not moving against
I
ISIS.
do understand that
far more gun
I do understand that there needs to be that conversation in talking about the
is the
talking about the
conversation.
terrorism piece, but there also
not an either
but there
or.
also
The terrorism
is
piece was
how
the piece.
that intersects
In this
together.
case, in South Carolina, a year ago, it was a young white kid.
And how would you
who
have kept?
walked-
How
hold
would
on,
your gun
hold
control
on.
measures had kept the Tsarnaev brothers from making their
Listen,
pressure cooker
Listen,
bombs, Steve?
the
This is
problem,
about terrorism.
the problem is the proliferation of guns. There are 350 million guns in circulation in this country, most of them, or many of them, in illegal hands. And all of them, hold
not
on,
by a long
and
shot.
all
most.
of them sold legally. All of them sold legally at some point. So the idea that legal sales should go on as they are, even though what you have is this incredible flow of guns from legal hands to illegal hands, and we should sit back and say, well, our liberty demands that we put up with this, I think is ridiculous.
So are you saying hold
and
the gun owners
offensive.
accountable who've had their
Hold
firearms
them-
stolen?
Absolutely. I mean, if I get my car stolen today, I can't just say, oh, well, oops, no big deal. I've got to go report that to the police.
course.
There's all kinds of tracking of that vehicle, what happens to it. My license is to operate a motor vehicle is somewhat dependent on those things. There's no reason that guns should be treated differently. Your right to bear arms is
And they
not.
aren't. You have
is
you
not-
have an obligation under the law to report a stolen gun,
and
Steve.
so then why are there so many guns in illegal possession?
Because simply reporting a gun doesn't recover it, Steve.
And doesn't hold anybody responsible once some gangbanger or terrorist or whoever uses it to
who's
kill
held
somebody.
responsible if somebody uses your car to kill somebody, Steve?
If
mean,
I
you
don't
forfeit
report it,
your rights
if
just
I don't
because
report
it's
it,
a weapon.
my point being,
But people do report their guns stolen. Who doesn't report a gun
My favorite
stolen?
example of this is just across the Detroit River, where you have a country that is not an unarmed nation, right? Canada has gun rights. But it is really difficult to get the gun. You have to pass a test. You have to have a license, and selling guns is very restricted. So the guns, about a third of the people in Canada own guns legally, and they don't have nearly the crime that we do. Is that
maybe
because
there are
there's
other
something
issues at
in the
work.
water on the other side of the river that's not over here? Of course not.
Perhaps it's a less violent culture.
Well, you know what? But then how about we get the money from Congress to be able to study what that gun culture is? And
Right.
that's a problem, too.
Great
So my
idea,
last
too.
question would be then everything that we saw happen in
Mm-hmm.
Congress this week, did the Democrats sit in for the wrong cause? Or will we finally start to see some movement because Republicans maybe don't want to go through some kind of re-election saying, I voted that I think that people on the no-fly list should have.
I
guns."
wish they'd put this to a vote and let all of these civil rights Democrats vote for a measure that strips Muslim Americans of their basic rights. Yeah, I wish they'd put it to a vote.
Last word on this.
I mean, I think we are talking about this particular issue maybe overshadowing the bigger issue, which I think is a much bigger investigation into what we can do. I don't want to infringe Nolan's rights, but I also don't want to put up with what we're putting up with now. The idea that we can't do anything about that with further gun restrictions is what I'm pushing back against.